United States and South Africa, for certain populations in certain places, it's premature to insist we manage HIV as a chronic disease, just like diabetes and asthma. It's inappropriate not to note the lingering scars of stigma in certain bodies, communities, and healthcare services. 3, HIV and AIDS intersects with social inequalities. HIV and AIDS intersects with and exacerbates existing social and health inequalities. Intersectionality shows how inequalities such as age, race, class overlap to create and reinforce marginalization. It names how one, structures such as racism, sexism, classism build on each other. 2, that these are interrelated and shape who we are. And 3, that one category cannot be understood without also understanding the others. Name it. Call out the cards that have aced your life and mine. Listen to how this gender, race, sexuality, disability, class come to live in this body, on this face, in this hair. Listen to how this gender, race, sexuality, disability, class come to live in this body, on this face, in this hair. See my complex colors, name them. Where there's no name, you can't see it. You can't see me. Where there's no name, you can't see it. You can't see me. 4, the social determines health. The social determines health. The social determinants of health remind us that our environment, where we are born, live, learn, work, play, worship, and age, significantly impact our health outcomes. Viruses attack vulnerabilities. Viruses attack vulnerabilities. Historical, long-standing, intersecting stacks of them. Historical, long-standing, intersecting stacks of them. While they don't discriminate, viruses thrive in bodies familiar with structural and systemic racism, income inequality, poverty, migration, unemployment. That these intersect with depression, anxiety, food insecurity, lack of quality health care, to create a nexus for infectious diseases to flourish. The impact of COVID, HIV, and chronic diseases is not equally distributed and felt. In South Africa, we see how inequalities interact with social cultural norms, gender and HIV risk, and impact the diagnosis and treatment and management of HIV, AIDS, and TB in particular ways. Sprague and colleagues show how the virus, poverty, race, and stigma work in concert to exert combined negative effects on HIV-positive African Americans' health and outcomes. In these and other contexts, there is no simple logic to apply. The negotiation and management of relationship and safe sex practices, HIV testing, condom use, finding and staying on treatment and PrEP is understandably fraught. 5, the social is not a barrier. The social is not a barrier. In HIV, the biomedical is always the winner. The biomedical is always the winner. Failure rests in the cultural, social, and political spaces of its translation. Suki Pax warned us more than a decade ago that the social is no barrier to biomedical HIV prevention. The social is the medium of its realization. The social is no barrier to biomedical HIV prevention. The social is the very medium of its realization. As we talk of ending AIDS, these words take on deeper significance. It's not the case of finding a way over or around social barriers, but recognizing how central these are to what it means to be human. A social approach moves beyond an over-reliance on individual capacities or responsibilities, or viewing social determinants as separate entities outside of ourselves. A social approach sees that our doings, our actions, are intimately tied to the enabling or disabling sets of social norms, practices, and institutions we move in. That these are shaped by what occurs in macro policy environments and are transformed or modified by community mobilization and social movements. The social is no barrier to biomedical HIV prevention. It is the medium of its realization. 6, we need radical interdisciplinarity. We need radical interdisciplinarity. Unpacking the relationship between the social context and individuals is the work of many of you, many of us in this room. Ethnographers, sociologists, anthropologists, political scientists, and humanities scholars. Our work, it's our work. These must integrate with the methodological, conceptual, and cognitive resources of the biomedical and the behavioral to address and find lasting solutions to HIV and AIDS. Clark and colleagues say this requires radical interdisciplinarity. Not social science added on as an afterthought, as a thin veneer to our biomedical main course, but integrated as we frame the questions, design the interventions. It will require value in all forms of knowledge, not just one. It will require value in all forms of knowledge, not just one. It will require boldness, political shifts we must demand. No more funding for magic bullets. No more funding for magic bullets. We have enough. We have enough. It's time for translation into life. Effectiveness studies and implementation science, biosocial, social bio, interdisciplinary studies that address complexities. It's time to have conceptual and methodological conversations about the limiting gold standards of efficacy, to find a way to conduct and value science that addresses the fullness, the messiness of life. We need real-world data that demonstrates social science understanding of the social determinants of health and poor HIV outcomes in socially excluded groups by untangling complex social processes within the larger social order. Only by joining forces can we produce the knowledge, the concepts, the insights that help account for the complexity of health and disease that will allow us to build sustainable interventions. When combined with social theory, such evidence can identify entry points for better health practice and interventions to address socially produced health inequities that may lead us to the end of AIDS. At the heart of the social science, humanities, and arts is imagination. Imagination. As my colleague Leslie Banks says, the value of imagination is needed now to produce innovative science. Imagination is required to reimagine our broken world, to revitalize our science and ourselves. There are years that ask questions and years that answer, says Zora Neale Hurston. There are years that ask questions and years that answer. Colleagues, the world is looking to us for these answers. 7, and finally, nothing about us without us. Nothing about us without us. In the landmark documentary, Nothing Without Us, the woman who will end AIDS, reproductive justice activist Gina Marie Brown, says in no uncertain terms, I am the woman that will end AIDS. I am the woman that will end AIDS. Without women, girls, femme, transgender, queer or questioning, intersex, asexual plus people, without incarcerated individuals, people who inject drugs, without women of African descent, black men around the world, there will be no end to AIDS. There will be no end to AIDS. The epidemic ends with me. The epidemic ends with me, with we. The needs and lived realities of marginalized groups will not be addressed until their voices are acknowledged and acted on. We need research that is not extractive, but participatory, engaged, inclusive, and transformative. Creative approaches from the arts and humanities, visuals, stories, dance, theater, poetry, have intrinsic value. They are central to and expressive of the human experience. They help us to think about ourselves and others, about culture, family, ethics, conflict, life and death, the world around us and the world within. Embedded in our research, they offer language and experience that people can recognize, engage, understand, and relate to. They help with comprehension simplified. They create resonance. When we do so, We engage people not just in our science, but re-energize them in their lives. In the process, we revitalize ourselves and our work. This is good for study outcomes, but good for people too. This is science for the greater good, science that makes a difference. I believe the last 3 lines of the poem also apply to social science and humanities scholars. We have to challenge the hegemony of the biomedical. This will require us to come out of our shadows, be bold and confident in our contributions, take the lead on the dance floor, be creative, imaginative, alive, wake ourselves up from the stupor of the last 40-odd years of the biomedicalization of AIDS. There will be no end to AIDS. The epidemic ends with me, the epidemic ends with we, the epidemic ends with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heidi. So the second speaker is Professor Henry de Vries, talking on the topic New Kids on the Block. What can STI HIV communities learn from hMPX? Welcome. Professor Henry de Vries is professor of skin infections at the University of Amsterdam, and he is a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians of London. He is currently employed at the Public Health Service Amsterdam Center for Sexual Health. He's also appointed as staff member at the Department of Dermatology at the Amsterdam University Medical Centers in the Netherlands. Is the microphone okay?
It works.
Perfect.
I think so, yes.
Yeah, and you got water. Perfect.
Yes. First of all, thanks a lot for the organizing committee to ask me to give this plenary to you. It's about hMPX, and I have no conflicts to share with you. I'd like to start with also the concluding slide to give you an overview of what you can expect in the next 15 minutes. First of all, I will address the discrepancy that we see in the hMPX outbreaks before and after 2022. It started already in the 1970s. The first cases were reported in Central and West Africa, and it has a completely different picture compared to what we have experienced in Western countries since 1 year. And that also reflects that as long as not all are safe, none of us will be safe, and it will be a wake-up call that we need to strengthen global health. Then I will also focus on mpox, how it behaves as a new sexually transmitted infection among gay and bisexual men who have sex with men. I will share with you the importance of the network structure in a heavy tail hypothesis, as it has been addressed last year, and the importance of sexual health clinics in the role they can play as surveillance sentinels and early warning systems for other sexually transmitted infections that we have seen in the past, like lymphogranuloma venereum, hepatitis C, and also enteric infections. And then lessons learned, do not rely on textbook knowledge when it comes to novel outbreaks. That what we've learned also from COVID-19, we see the same thing happening with mpox. And the importance also of alignment with a key population to address these outbreaks, and how again and again public health preparedness is something that we know we should do, but as soon as the outbreak is over, urgency wanes, and we see exactly the same thing happening again. So the mpox outbreaks before May 2022, as I said, they were focused in Central and West Africa, and the clinical picture was completely different. What we mainly saw were umbilicated papules and ulcers. Forgive me my medical language as a dermatologist. I will show you only one slide with gross pictures, and then it's over. So you are prepared already. What we saw there was limited human-to-human transmission. If it happened, it was through airborne and skin-skin contacts within households, and it remained confined within households. And the main transmission routes were zoonotic, so contact with animals, especially rats and rodents, in the surroundings of where the outbreaks occurred. Sexual transmission was not reported until 2017 in a Nigerian study, and also anal genital lesions were not reported in the same study before. Mortality was high, between 1% and 10%, especially the Central African clade. There was a distinction between a West African clade and a Central African clade. The Central African clade, which was in the DRC, about 10% of the persons who were diagnosed with it died. And these were mainly children and pregnant women. And there were limited outbreaks through contact of migrants who lived in Western countries, like in London and also in New York, they were reported, and who visited friends and family in the country they came from. So here you see the first outbreaks. The first were reported in 1970. They were predicted because around that time global campaigns against human smallpox vaccination, they ended. So people already predicted that other pox viruses would replace human pox, and that is what happened. The numbers were very slow, were very low, as you see, but that's probably a tip of the iceberg. That's what you see in the studies in 2000 and 2009. You see that the suspected cases were far higher. And that probably also explains why the mortality rate was so high, because only those people who were very sick and had access to healthcare in the first place, they were diagnosed eventually with mpox, and the rest of the people who did not enter the statistics, they went unnoticed. So we knew it was there. We could have stopped it right there if we had more strengthened the health infrastructures in sub-Saharan Africa. So this is the slide I warned you for. Mpox outbreak since May 2022 looks completely different. It was first noticed in sexual health clinics in Portugal, in Spain, and then a few weeks later the virus was isolated from a similar case in a London sexual health clinic. It has a different clinical appearances. It goes in two waves, a biphasic appearances. First is the rash, and then a few days later, the pustules and papules, which mimic the ones that we saw in African patients arise. The large majority, over 99%, affects gay and bisexual men and sexed men, but also transgender women are affected. And transmission is mainly through sexual contact and close contact, like kissing, for example. The clinical picture is also different, is that we see a lot of genital symptoms, severe rectal pain, and that's also in many cases the reason why people were admitted to the hospital, because pain relief could not be performed in the home situation. And rarely we see now airway symptoms, which were described a lot in the African outbreaks. And the mortality is far less lower, as I said, and that probably has to do with access to health institutions. So Amsterdam was one of the hotspots of mpox within Europe. Here you see a picture. The 5 top countries that were affected were Spain, Portugal, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. And within Amsterdam, or within the Netherlands, we saw that over 50% occurred in Amsterdam, which used to be called the gay capital. I don't think it still has that title, but there's a large gay and bisexual men who have sex with men community residing in Amsterdam. So this is a perfect epidemiological bell-shaped curve, what you would expect. And you see that the top was during the summer days, and it started in the end of May, around May 20th. The first case was diagnosed, and this person could be related. He probably got it around the time of King's Day, which is a national holiday, April 27. There's a lot of festivities going on. There was also a big gay and leather festival in Belgium. Darklands it was called. It was earlier in that month. So people were looking for super spreader events. Also Gay Pride in Gran Canaria, for example, was suspected to be important in the transmission throughout Europe through the party circuit which is existing within Europe. The main incubation period is around 3 weeks. So that's why we extrapolated that around these events it might have occurred that the spread started. So as soon as the first patient was identified at the end of May, quarantine measures were imposed in the Netherlands through the public health authorities. And around that time, people still thought that airborne transmission was highly likely. So they were very strict, comparable to the ones that were imposed during the COVID-19 pandemic. Post-exposure prophylaxis with vaccination again. Smallpox vaccines were also implied. And it took very long, about half a year before pre-exposure vaccination was occurred. We were much criticized by that it was too slow. And again, that stresses the importance of being prepared and having, for example, computer registry systems ready for immediate vaccination. But we'll come back to that later on. Gay Pride Amsterdam occurs around August, beginning of August. Again, it was much feared that it would be a super spreading event. By then already health authorities like ECDC and also CDC in the United States really stressed out that especially it's important to have communication and have people instructed how to prevent mpox transmission, which is far better than to cancel those opportunities that these events offer to you. So we had a lot of, together with communities, we had a lot of engagement to inform people what mpox looked like, what you should do, get tested, quarantine yourself, and how to deal with the symptoms. And with that we hoped we could fight it. We still don't know what exactly was the key thing that stopped the epidemic here. And as Heidi van Rooyen already said also in her plenary before me, biomedical interventions can only thrive within a social construct. And behavioral change, for example, is probably also important in that sense. So when did it all start? We tried to find the first patients. We thought it probably already was simmering for a long time. We didn't find any when we took samples we had stored in the Amsterdam and Rotterdam sexual health clinics from February on. The first cases were found in the first weeks of May. And this coincides also with the cases reported in the UK, in Spain and Portugal. So there's no evidence of widespread mpox transmission prior to May 22. And this coincides with the moment that COVID-19 travel bans were relaxed. And it occurred in an internationally highly intertwined network of sexually active gay and bisexual men who have sex with men. We also did a cross-sectional study around that time when we had the first 1,000 persons diagnosed with mpox. And what we see is that the picture is, it involves men in their 30s. The far majority have sex with men. Amsterdam was an outlier with over 50% of the cases reported there. 21 were living with HIV, 21%, 33% used pre-exposure prophylaxis. And with this picture, it mimics the same population which is affected by lymphogranuloma venereum, hepatitis C, and also enteric infections. So we were in the lucky situation that we had 100,000 dosages of the third generation modified vaccinia virus vaccine which is safe in the sense that it's replication incompetent. It was ordered in 2019 by the Ministry of Defense as a preparation for biological warfare attacks. And they gave them free to be used in this outbreak. The uptake of the vaccination was disappointing. We had expected more people would show up. 46% of the persons who were invited, because based on the results we had from the cross-sectional study, only people we consider to have a big chance to get mpox, for example, people living with HIV, people on pre-exposure prophylaxis, they were invited. But only 35% got fully vaccinated, which implies 2 vaccinations. More of those using pre-exposure prophylaxis. Among those who live with HIV, the uptake was lower, and in Amsterdam it was a little higher. So to conclude, a large part of the key population is still naive. Here you see how the outbreak evolved globally. Europe was in the lead in this sense, and it picked up a little later, about a month later, especially in the Americas, North and South America. And there was a lot of chaos going on, especially in the United States, where for a long time they were hesitant to go out, that especially gay and bisexual men and transgender persons were affected by this epidemic. But now, up until end of May of this year, you see that it's really waning off. Although we saw the last case with mpox last Monday of a guy who had traveled to London and probably got it there. And we also hear about cases, again, reported from Belgium, from France. In Japan, it arrived later. First cases were reported in January, but you see a steep increase into March. Again, most cases were around their 40s. Most lived in Tokyo, and it looks like sustained local transmission is possible. It's a naive population. I had 15 minutes. I started later also. Okay. Okay. So this could be a new point of new transmission worldwide. As you can see, Japan is a heavily traveled area. So why did mpox stay confined to a large majority to gay and bisexual men? It's a heavy-tailed sexual network. Here you see the number of sexual contacts. It is in a modeling study which appeared in Science. Of gay and bisexual men, and you see that in the last 21 days, a large proportion, a small proportion, the heavy tail has over 30 contacts. And that probably affected also the transmission of infections. If you look at the sustained attack rate, you see that with this heavy tail, it's feasible that you have an R0 above 1, and like in COVID-19, this is probably important for sustained transmission. And this is not feasible in the heterosexual population based on the number of sex partners they have in general. So why did it go down as rapidly? Group immunity is probably very important. The heavy tail component, as you see also on the sexual network, either was vaccinated or they have natural immunity because they got it. And as soon as they were naturally immune, that probably could have caused the downturn of the number of infections. Behavioral change is probably also important. We saw a drop of 30%. Yes, I will. Vaccination is not very feasible. End of festival season, we didn't see any association with that. So the alignment of public health institutions is very important. This is Dr. Dimitri Daskalis, who was a US White House senior figure appointed to respond to the monkeypox outbreak in the United States, and he is also advocate and openly gay man. The stigma I will skip for you. What can we expect in the coming days? Resurgence like it was is not expected. Probably there will be low numbers of sporadic outbreaks among men who have sex with men. and elimination is long away. So to end, and this I already told you, so that's a good thing, you already knew it. We need to be more prepared for next outbreaks, which are very feasible that they could happen. Thank you very much for your attention. And just to squeeze in, there will be an STI-focused conference by the International Union of STI in Malta by the end of this year. So you will hear more about hMPX if you're interested. Please join. Thank you.
Then we ask Angelina Namiba. Angelina. Very welcome. Angelina is originally from Kenya and has over 26 years experiences of working in the HIV sector on different initiatives, ranging from providing one-to-one support to people living with HIV, treatment advocacy, managing service delivery to facilitating, promoting and advocating for the involvement of women living with HIV, informing local and national strategy and policy. Living with HIV for 29 years, she also sits on various national and international advisory boards. And very welcome, Angelina, that will talk on how do women living with HIV achieve in a good quality of life beyond viral suppression.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Can you hear me if I speak from here? Oh, now? Lovely. Thank you very much. So that was a bit about my professional life, and you've had a little bit about my personal life. In addition to living with HIV for about 29 years now, 30 nearly, I'm also a very proud mother of a daughter who is 24 years old. She was born 5 years after my diagnosis, which means I was lucky enough to access treatment, so she was born HIV-free. She's also a singer-songwriter. She goes under the name of Hamza, Hamzaa. If you'd like to listen to her music on Spotify and Apple Music, etc. I did say I was a proud mother. So, but in addition to being a very proud mother, I have a great network of friends, women living with HIV, my wing women, my soulmates, and more, many of whom have shaped and informed this presentation in one way or another. One of them is sitting in the audience right there. Susan, wave your hand. So I chose the title of this presentation because women living with HIV have lives beyond viral suppression. We are diverse, and we have varied capabilities, interests, and responsibilities. We are friends, we are sisters, we are lovers, we are wives, we are mothers, we are beautiful, very articulate. Some of us are even naughty but nice. The list goes on. As such, living with HIV and achieving a good quality of life for us goes way beyond viral suppression. Of course, adhering to treatment and maintaining and achieving an undetectable viral load is a key part of our lives. However, it's not the only goal or the only aim. So, having said all that, how then do we achieve a good quality of life? We do this by following the 5 steps to well-being. We are active, we create connections, we give back, we take notice of what's going on around us and in our bodies, and we keep learning. So I've picked on a few ways that we do this in terms of how we achieve a good quality of life beyond viral suppression. The list is by no means exhaustive, but I feel it's kind of quite representative of what we do. So the first thing we do is that we are active. My friend Susan over there has dogs, so she takes them for a walk every morning. Most mornings, probably. Most mornings. My friend Memory walks every day, religiously for 10 kilometers. My other friend Sylvia does yoga every day. My friend Julie swims every single day, including in open air pools, even in the winter. I myself am very human, so I swim only once a week in the YMCA, which is very much indoors. But in addition to these traditional activities, women living with HIV are very active against stigma. We all know that stigma kills communities. Stigma prevents people from testing for HIV, it prevents people from talking about HIV, and it prevents people from telling significant others about their HIV status, which in turn stops and prevents them from accessing and staying engaged in life-giving services and health and social care services that keep us alive. So we know that women living with HIV experience stigma in society as well as services, but they also experience self-stigma. And so over the years, we, as women living with HIV, have recognized that there are things that we can do as individuals in order to address and tackle self-stigma. We know, A, that we can change the way we think about HIV. HIV is a very tiny virus. It doesn't define who we are. In fact, you have to look for it under a microscope. It's only a tiny part of our lives. The other thing we've realized is that we can mind the language that we use around HIV. And you've put it well, so I won't even mention anything, but we know that the language that we use, if used negatively, can further impact on stigma. But if used positively, it can make a whole lot of difference. We also know that it's important for us to kick stigma out of our lives by not accepting the negativity that is pointed at us. And also we know that instead of spreading fear around HIV, we can share facts about how HIV has moved on and changed. And one way that we do this is by sharing facts about U equals U in an informative and fun way. This is a 15-minute video where my friend and I, Susan, we shared facts about U equals U, and as I teach her how to make U equals U t-shirts, she can't sew to save her life. We had a lot of fun, and the title of this video is called U equals U t-shirt making, Fighting Stigma One Stitch at a Time. The title was coined by my daughter. But it was important to also say that we can do it little steps at a time. I want to also give a huge shout out to Fast Track Cities London for funding this project, which the video was produced in conjunction with AIDSImpact, and I see Matthew in the audience over there. It was a great collaboration. But I wanted to shout out to Fast Track Cities because what they did was they got together a community of practice of different organizations and asked us to put together and develop a manual around training and addressing self-stigma. And then they went on to fund the organization to actually deliver the program. So I think it's a great thing. So the second thing that we do is that we connect. We create very healthy relationships. And as we create our relationships, one of the things we do is also we encourage each other to have good relationships with significant others. Remember I said some of us are lovers? So we feel it's important that as friends, we need to encourage each other to have good relationships. This is a list. I don't know if you can see it. You can, okay. It's a list that was put together. It's called the Love List. It was put together by members of the Forum Network when we had one of our regular date night sessions. It's a session that we have around group support, but we also do a lot of information. So this is a list of what they came up in terms of if someone is still looking for a partner or is in a relationship, a few of the things that are important to have. But we also connect by having an annual Women Living with HIV Bring a Dish barbecue, which is held every year in Sylvia Petretti's garden. This is a photo that was taken last year, and the next barbecue, in case any of you are in London, living with HIV, women living with HIV, is going to be on the 15th of July. We have fun at the barbecues, but many great ideas have been hatched at these barbecues. In fact, the Catwalk for Power, who some of you know about, was actually hatched in this garden. I'll talk a little bit about it in a later slide. Of course, I only go to the barbecue for the nyama choma and the Prosecco. We also connect in a much more structured way, and as a founder member of the Forum Network of Mental Mothers Living with HIV, I would be remiss if I didn't give a little mention to Forum. Forum stands for My Health, My Choice, My Child, My Life. It is a perinatal peer mentoring project which works with mental mothers living with HIV where we train them to support their peers through the pregnancy journey, as well as for their own personal development. It's very similar to the 3P project, Positive Pregnancy Peers, which is here, part of the Positiva Gruppen organization. And I'm really glad to have had a chance to meet with them and do training with them. So, as already mentioned earlier, our project is very much of the ethos of nothing about us without us. We work with women living with HIV. Our work is led by and informed by women living with HIV. But we also have an excellent steering group of healthcare professionals, clinicians, researchers, some of them may be in the room today, who guide the project at every stage. This photo is of the Forum Network members who are based in London, in the UK, but we also have some members, a few members in Kenya and Uganda. And the pregnant mentor mama you see there, last one, already gave birth, and our baby is already over a year old now. Number 3, we also maintain a good quality of life by giving and receiving joy. Many of us, women living with HIV, give back by volunteering in different capacities, for different reasons, and in different organizations. So for instance, I volunteer for the Mildmay Mission Hospital in London. I do that once a week. Many of you may have heard of it, and I believe Simon Rackstraw, who's the clinical director of the Mildmay, is in the audience somewhere. I don't know where he is, but he is here. Mildmay is a fantastic hospital, and I have a lot of personal connections. It holds a very special place in my heart. In the early years of the epidemic, my brother, who also had HIV, but that was the pre-treatment era, was looked after at the Mildmay, and he subsequently passed away there. And years later, from around 1999 to 2000, my daughter went to a nursery school which was there at the Mildmay in those days. And more recently, around 2020, I was a long-term patient at the Mildmay, and where I was incredibly well cared for to be able to be here today. So volunteering for them once a week is a very small way of me giving back. But many of us do that. And we also do give the joy and receive the joy, and I'm going to touch on just 2 really important projects. We do it by being members of the Joyful Noise Choir. Joyful Noise Choir is an initiative of the Nurse Project London, and it is a music therapy choir for people living with HIV. The Joyful Noise Choir has made a huge difference in the lives of women living with HIV and other people living with HIV. As I'm talking about women, I'm going to keep referring to women. I'm by no means ignoring other communities. And although the Joyful Noise Choir has very many members, the photo is just of a few of us who are very happy to be open about our status publicly. We have many other members who are not ready yet, and we respect their confidentiality, and that's what's a good thing about the choir, is that one of the things, and that's why I probably am there, because I can only do karaoke, is you don't have to be able to sing to join the choir. You just have to have a love for singing, and that's all it is. The other project that we give and we join, we give joy and receive joy, is a Catwalk for Power, which I alluded to earlier on. Catwalk for Power is a project that was set up to create actions to address the silence around women and HIV. It was set up in 2017 by women from Positively UK and artists from ACT UP chapter of London. Women with HIV have been powerful activists since the beginning of the epidemic. However, it is still very rare to see our voices, our stories and experiences, and to see them and to hear them. What Catwalk for Power wanted to do was to create a platform to communicate about our lives and celebrate our achievements, our power, our beauty, and creativity, not just to our communities, but to the wider world. So both of these initiatives are aimed at enabling us to get therapy, skills, reduce isolation, have fun, and challenge stigma in a proactive way, all of which lead to a good quality of lives. So the other thing that we do is we take notice. We take notice of what is around us and take time to enjoy nature and appreciate it. We also take notice of what is happening with our bodies. Many of us are aging, quite disrespectfully, I might add. Some of us, in fact, many of us, me included, never thought we'd get to this age. So when I was diagnosed at age 25, I didn't even think I was going to live to be 30. So here I am a few years later. So I really, really appreciate and savor every moment that I'm alive. But with aging comes comorbidities. So we, as women living with HIV, take notice of that and do our best to address them, of course, with our wonderful clinicians. Again, many of whom are in the room today. But with aging too, also comes the menopause, or the mental pause, as was described by one of the women whom my friend and sister, Dejan Diallo, was working with. So Dejan later coined the term, the definition of the mental pause as a 5 minute to 5 hours to many days lapse in memory brought on by the onset of menopause. So now you know what it means. But I digress, and back to the topic. And one way we take notice is by joining programs like the Bearded and Flashed. Bearded and Flashed is a creative writing project which is aimed at addressing the menopause in a fun, irreverent, non-apologetic way, and talk about living with HIV and the menopause. Many of us in that age group took part in the program, and we were led by a wonderful actress called Maggie Saunders and a lovely lady called Judy Oti, I don't know if she's here yet, who led the workshops, and we got to write about our experiences. Some women had never written before, but it was a fantastic project. The output from the project include our writing, we did virtual workshops, and a 15-minute short film around living with HIV and the menopause. You can find it on the website there. And the project was jointly done again, which I love about it. 3 minutes. I think I'm going to do the same as he did, because you took my 5 minutes, right? So I'm going to take my 5 minutes back. I'll take it. I'm nearly done. So the project was jointly done by 4 organizations, which I think is a great thing, because we're often working in silos, but this was a great way for the 4 organizations to work together. So the 5th point, which is the 5th way of living, is we keep learning, and we keep learning by maintaining good relationships. This is a group of my friends, Charity on the left, Rebecca, Winnie, Memory, and together we are called Zook, because the 2 of them on the left come from Zambia, Winnie comes from Uganda, Memory comes from Zimbabwe, I come from Kenya, and we live in the UK. So together we're Zook Africa United. We've known each other for over 20 years. We initially met at support groups and through work, and we carried on supporting each other. Some of the things that we've done is during the lockdown, we've maintained a weekly call to check in on each other. They supported me a lot, also through my illness. And during that time, I also encouraged them to set up a book club, because we were busy, we were reading other people's books. And we thought, why don't we, what we then decided to do was to do a picture book of us, but that was just the beginning. And at some point, Winnie, who is in the middle there, was doing an interview and on Wild Days Day, and they asked her, oh, so what about African communities? What's happening there? And she thought, actually, what is happening? So she brought the idea to us, and the seed of the book that we've written. Yeah, I am just about to conclude. We wrote a book called Our Stories Told by Us, which is celebrating the African contribution to the UK HIV response. So this is my last slide. We dared to dream, and our dream became a reality. And as the late, great Madiba said, it always seems impossible until it is done. We've got an abstract at the conference, poster number 14. Come and see me later if you'd like to hear more, on Wednesday, if you'd like to hear more about the book. I have brought only 1 copy of the book because we are still organizing, getting it done online. I brought the book. Lorraine, this is for you.
Okay, thank you, Angelina.
Thank you very much.
We call the next speaker Professor Claude Ann Mellins. Claude Ann Mellins from the Columbia University Irving Medical Center and the New York State Psychiatric Institute. Claude Ann Mellins is a clinical psychologist with over 30 years of experience conducting research and developing programs focused on psychosocial aspects of HIV disease, including mental health in children, adolescents, young adults, and families in the US and globally, including South Africa, Uganda, Mozambique, and Thailand. And Claude Ann Mellins will talk about HIV in children and young people. Please, Claude.
So now that you've aged me, if I have that 15-minute mental pause that Angelina was just talking about, you'll excuse me. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you today about a population I never thought would make it to adulthood when I started this work in the 1990s, namely young people who've grown up with perinatally acquired HIV, or PHIV as I'll shorthand it. Today I'm going to focus on mental health, which I think this audience knows can be critical to health outcomes, but also is an important outcome in its own right and critical to resilience. The first point I want to make today is that to truly turn the tide on the HIV/AIDS global epidemic, we're going to have to pay attention to adolescents and young adults. With advances in treatment that promote health, nearly 2 million children under the age of 15 are estimated to be living with HIV, the majority with PHIV. And then there are also an additional 5 million youth aged 15 to 24 living with HIV, many with PHIV, but also other forms of acquired. And although there are tremendous advances in prevention of vertical transmission, it's not zero. So given new cases of HIV in children, we're going to have an adolescent and young adult epidemic for many years to come. This is particularly of concern given that youth with HIV are less likely to be virally suppressed compared to adults. So what do we know about normative adolescence that makes this a challenging developmental stage? I'm not going to go over this in detail, but this picture is really just a reminder of the tremendous physical, cognitive, family, and social challenges and changes that go on during this time, with brain development ongoing until at least 25, and social shifts from family to peers, with both being needed. Adolescents are developing and struggling with decision-making, need for independence, and a sense of identity emotionally, also in terms of gender and sexuality. So things can go well or not. To quote Ronald Dahl, a pediatrician, adolescence is a paradox. In almost every domain, this should be a developmental period of strength and resilience. And yet, despite this, overall rates of morbidity and mortality increased by 200%, with the primary causes of death and disability being due to difficulties regulating emotions and behavior, in other words, mental health. And unfortunately, we have a mental health crisis in youth in the general population that was only exacerbated during COVID. Globally, 1 in 7 10 to 19-year-olds estimated to be living with a mental disorder, with depression and anxiety leading causes of illness and disability for adolescents. Death by suicide was the 4th leading cause of death for 15 to 29-year-olds in 2021. And 15% of adolescents in low and middle income countries have considered suicide, 20% in the United States. Unfortunately, the numbers are even worse in adolescents and young adults living with HIV. In one recent review by Lucy Kluver and colleagues, globally, 25% of adolescents living with HIV, or 1 in 4, met criteria for any psychiatric disorder, with higher rates of emotional distress. And to give you a few examples from Botswana, Spain, Thailand, and Cambodia, to name just a few, there are really high rates of mental health symptoms, including anxiety and depression, based on validated symptom checklists, anywhere from 21% in Thailand and Cambodia to 44% in Botswana. And of particular concern, suicidality, where rates in youth range from 15 to 29% having suicidal ideation. 11% in Thailand had a history of attempts. And in New York City, in a cohort study, CASA, that I'm going to talk about in a minute, in a study led by Phil Krasinski, adolescents and young adults with PHIV were twice as likely to make a suicide attempt as a comparison group of adolescents and young adults with perinatal HIV exposure. Both groups high, by the way. So as high as these numbers are, I'm now going to present data suggesting that it's an underestimate. So CASA is a cohort study based in New York that I lead with youth with PHIV and perinatal exposure, first enrolled when they were 9 to 16 and followed now for 20 years, in which we give a full diagnostic psychiatric interview. So this first slide shows cross-sectional snapshots of rates of different categories of disorders at 5 time points in youth with PHIV. At base, I'm just going to make 2 points here. At baseline, when youth were 9 to 16, you can see relatively high rates of any disorder, primarily driven by non-substance use psychiatric disorders, especially anxiety. By the time we get to follow-up 5, when all youth are over the age of 18, rates of any disorders go up, but now they're more driven by high rates of substance use disorder as well as anxiety, with an increase in mood disorders. And while these rates are high and correspond with the data I showed you from other countries, my team began to wonder, are they actually underestimates? So in other words, are these the same youth at each time point or different youth, and does this capture the developmental burden? So we looked at rates of disorders across those same 5 time points and asked the question, what % of youth met diagnostic criteria for a disorder at least once, and what % 2 or more times? And so in fact, the data suggests cross-sectional snapshots substantively underestimate the developmental impact of mental health on young people. So over 80% of the CASA sample of PHIV young people met criteria for a disorder at least once, and over 50% at 2 or more time points. It's primarily driven by non-substance use disorders, psychiatric disorders, but substance use disorders are still high, and this is disorder, not use. Anxiety, mood disorders, behavioral disorders, highly prevalent. And so the key take-home message here is we need to be screening for mental health problems across adolescence and young adulthood, or we may miss people if we just do it once. To quote UNICEF, we can't manage what we don't know. So, what do we know puts this population at risk for mental health challenges, particularly those who've grown up with HIV, but also other populations of young people with HIV? And this model highlights range of systemic risk factors that have been associated with mental health and health in studies globally. So many of these young people are growing up in families confronting extreme poverty with unstable housing and food insecurity. They're from disadvantaged communities with high rates of neighborhood violence and crime and exposure to trauma. Many have experienced caregiver illness and death. In some countries, they're born into families decimated by substance use and mental health problems. Many from minoritized families who've coped with racism and discrimination, as well as HIV stigma. And there are disruptions in education due to poverty or health or limited resources in the community. And lastly, there are disparities in healthcare access and quality that were only exacerbated during COVID. And we all know, I think, that barriers to transition from pediatric or adolescent clinics to adult clinics can be associated with worse outcomes. But I want to pause for a minute. I've only shown you risks for poor mental health outcomes. And historically, research has focused on risks and deficits. Yet despite that, and despite all the biopsychosocial risks I showed you, young people living with HIV across the globe have exhibited resilience even when there are mental health challenges. I'm just going to give you one example. In a US-based study, FACTS, which is a cohort of adolescents and young adults like CASA with PHIV and perinatal exposure, many of them are achieving adolescent and young adult milestones, including education and work that you see here at rates higher than the general population from some of their communities. And in our CASA cohort, we found similar rates and also high hope for the future. And high hope for the future was protective against suicidal ideation. So this speaks to a need for socio-ecological understanding of resilience, as described in a Malawi-based study. A strength-based perspective can enable insights into positive outcomes among adolescents living with HIV to counter dominant negative narratives. So this picture summarizes studies on predictors of mental health and health challenges, but reframing the narrative to focus on protective factors based on a number of studies. So start with adolescents themselves at the top, self-esteem, coping and problem solving, future orientation, all associated with better mental health outcomes. But also let's include the social and systemic level factors that influence mental health that I just showed you in the previous slide, but from a strength-based perspective. Very importantly, if you look on the left, families. Positive caregiver-youth relationships, communication, involvement, family support have all been associated with better behavioral health outcomes, including mental health. And yes, peers can be associated with risk behavior, bullying, and stigma, but conversely, they can be a source of social support and provide positive norms about health, substance use, and sexual risk. Provision of economic resources on the right side of this, as well as resources that aim to reduce stress and trauma exposure, have been associated with positive mental health. And then lastly, back on the left, relationships with doctors and the medical systems may be a critical protective factor we've not sufficiently examined. So the message here is that we need to be addressing multiple spokes of this model. Unfortunately, to date, there are very few evidence-based interventions for adolescents and young adults with HIV that address mental health and multiple protective factors. There are lots of reasons for this I won't get into, including siloing of services, as well as mental health not being a priority. But there are promising interventions in the field. I know we're going to hear about some of them over the next 3 days. And also, I'm going to just give you a couple of examples here. So the first set of interventions attempt to integrate mental health, and risk reduction. CHAMP Plus, or VUCA, as it's called in South Africa, is a program my colleague Mary McKay and I created with our colleagues in the US, South Africa, and Thailand. Based on Mary's work with the CHAMP program funded by NIH, it's for early adolescents. Multiple families come together for a group intervention with a cartoon-based curriculum so that families can talk about the characters and difficult topics before addressing them themselves. They talk about parent-child relationships, family support, and helping youth cope with risk reduction, adherence to treatment, stigma, and problem solve. There have been greater improvements in mental health, in adherence, and viral suppression. The next model I want to just highlight here is Combinado. This is a project funded by NICHD that my colleague Elaine Abrams leads in Mozambique, a very poor country with very few mental health professionals. So this multi-component intervention for 13 to 19-year-olds addresses adolescent medical needs, provides peer support around adherence, risk reduction, and well-being, and addresses social systems with an anti-stigma campaign in the community. Importantly, this intervention was designed in full partnership with youth stakeholders in a human-centered design approach. It's in the field being tested now. That brings me to the second group of programs that focus on peer-led support. We know it takes a teenager often to help a teenager in crisis. So the Zivandiri, or CATS program, combines community and health facility-based prevention, treatment, care, and support services for children, adolescents, and young adults living with HIV in Tanzania. It's focused on health, mental health, and risk reduction. It's led by peer mentors known as CATS, or Community Adolescent Treatment Supporters, and there's a growing literature on this program's benefit across outcomes. It's recognized globally as a best practice. The second intervention example is Safe Haven. This was adapted from the Friendship Bench study, originally established in Zimbabwe, and then in Botswana for youth living with and at risk for HIV, led by Dr. Marion Brooks for 13 to 25-year-olds. Peers with HIV are trained to administer problem-solving therapy, a form of cognitive behavioral treatment. They spend 4 to 6 sessions with participants in youth-friendly, non-judgmental settings, flexible to youth schedules, food is provided, and it focuses on improvements in mental health outcomes with very promising results. So this last category here focuses on promoting health and mental health by addressing economic barriers. It's hard to pay attention to your mental health or even physical health when your basic living needs and safety are challenging. are challenged. So the first intervention is SUBI, led by my colleague Fred Sowamala. Its core is an economic empowerment program to improve the capacity of the child, family, and community. It's developed and tested with vulnerable youth in Uganda and other countries. Youth are able to open bank accounts. The NIH grant matches dollar for dollar what's saved by the youth, who are also taught vocational skills. Money can only be used for vocation or school. Caregivers also participate in ways to support the youth and themselves. For youth with HIV, everyone gets a cartoon-based adherence counseling based on VUCA, and it has had a significant impact on mental health, viral suppression 2 years later, and a range of other outcomes. And then last, Cash Plus Care. This is based on the work of Lucy Kluver and Lorraine Scher and their teams. Although it's not their intervention per se, they've been studying the impact of government cash transfers in South Africa, along with parenting support, other safety nets, and found strong associations with a range of health and psychosocial outcomes in young people with HIV. And I know Lucy's going to talk about this, and probably Lorraine. So I'm going to come back to this picture, a reminder we need to address the wide range of factors that influence mental health and health risk behaviors and promote resilience, including family and social and economic supports, focusing on positive messaging for youth. So I'm leaving you with the voices of some New York young people living with HIV. They've grown up with perinatal HIV, who are research consultants to CASA. I asked them what resilience means to them and what's helped them thrive when many of their peers did not, and they said, resilience is about perseverance, knowing who your support systems are, that you can lean on them. It's about ability to weather storms, and perhaps you come out stronger on the other end. And it's also about relationships, support, and self-acceptance. And finally, it's about hope, even in the context of fear and doctors who care. Now is the time to move towards scalable, deliverable models to maximize coping and resilience. I know we're going to be hearing a lot more about this over the next few days. It takes a village to do this work. Here are some of the people who've been my village. 2 of them are in the room or in the overflow room, Ohima Poku and Phil Kroniski, and my team back in New York. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I don't know if it's... Thank you. It's indeed an honor for me to present to you our final speaker, Professor Virginia Bond. She's a professor of anthropology and public health policy at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, but she's based in Zambia. She will be focusing on HIV testing ideas, and I think much of your research has been looking at testing, uptake, and barriers. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, just to say it's lovely to be back in Sweden. I started my career really in research on a study being funded by SAREC and working with the Karolinska Institute, so very happy to be back here. So my own my main argument today was inspired by my own recent experience, which was when my husband was extremely ill late last year, and the doctors said in South Africa that they were going to test him for HIV in front of myself and my daughter, who's 26, I think very liberal, very sassy, and she said to me, "Mum, if Dad has HIV, that means he's been unfaithful to you." And it just made me realize that some social dynamics have not shifted in the last 30 years, and this very much resounds with everyone who's presented ahead of me, including Alexandra in the opening session. When I first tested for HIV in 1988, I had the same question, that I wasn't somebody surely who would have HIV because of my demographic. So my focus today is on 4 key HIV testing social experiences for individuals who test HIV positive. And I'm drawing mainly on research carried out in Zambia and South Africa from a large community randomized trial called POPART that aimed to and succeeded in reducing HIV incidence in 24 urban communities. And what I'm arguing that these persisting testing experiences point to the need to kind of go back to old strategies, to bring back in more counselling, which was more widely used before treatment in the late 1980s and in the early 1990s than it is now. So we know that there's been tectonic shifts in HIV testing, that technology has changed hugely, that treatment is very widely available and accessed, and that routine HIV testing and screening across facilities in different community places and to reach different populations is in place. We also know that there's a rapid expansion in HIV testing uptake in context of high HIV prevalence. And the pop art data shows us this very convincingly. We started with very high levels of knowledge of HIV testing and knowledge of status, and this increased, and we increased the number of people who knew that they were living with HIV across Zambia and South Africa. We also heard that there was widespread community support for everyone testing and knowing their status in the same communities. And indeed, when we were trying to recruit for a qualitative cohort in 2015 and 16, we really struggled to find people who had never tested for HIV or who would admit to never having tested for HIV. We also saw shifts in policy language and HIV discourse around testing. We saw that the counselling started to be dropped, and we're hearing more and more the term case finding in relation to HIV testing. So this is a graph from the pop art trial that just shows very high levels of knowledge of HIV testing in 7 intervention communities at the beginning, and that increased over the 3 years. But there's an anomaly here, isn't there? That we have high HIV testing uptake, but we have limited disclosure. Most people living with HIV in Zambia and South Africa do not widely disclose. Mostly they're very wary of social consequences of others knowing that they have HIV for very good reason. And most people living with HIV do not belong to formal networks of people living with HIV, and that testing HIV positive remains a life event. And I noticed that this is still a statement in the WHO HIV testing guidelines. And this, as we've heard today many times, is because testing positive initially can be very fraught with anxiety, and this can reoccur according to circumstances that change. It's also laden with disclosure dilemmas about who to tell, when and how. And we learned again in pop art that on average, even with a huge amount of effort, that it still takes people 6 to 10 months to link into care once they find out they're living with HIV. So to return to my 4 main points, the first one is trust. So the quote here is from a woman who was in her mid-30s, who was retesting every 3 months, living in a Lusaka urban community. Her husband was living with HIV, he was very abusive, and she just recently lost a baby. This was a loss that she attributed to her HIV and to having an abusive husband. And this quote reflects the mistrust in their marriage from both sides. So as we heard from the woman, one aspect of trust is distrust within relationships, and indeed a downside of couple HIV testing is sexual relations stopping and experiences of mental abuse and abandonment. And in an ethnography of young women living in Lusaka, the pattern was that the young women didn't tell their boyfriends that they were living with HIV, and one young woman who had done so just said that it resulted in other people learning and that it really made her lose her trust. We also see a mistrust in technology, rumors about false positives, worries about the accuracy of HIV testing results, worries that health staff are being incentivized to diagnose people HIV positive, and also a pattern of testing, retesting elsewhere to confirm your status, and even new techniques, as if HIV oral self-testing, are leading to some anxiety and mistrust and doubts about the accuracy. We also see that health staff and community health workers are not always trusted to be confidential, and that on the whole, people living with HIV are very selectively disclosing to people that they see as trustworthy. If we look now at stigma, these quotes reflect both how stigma has evolved, that there's a stigma linked now to not testing for HIV, and also how it's persisted in the same forms and causes with deep-rooted associations. So there's a lot of evidence now that HIV testing has become to be you're a sort of good moral citizen if you test for HIV. Equally, if you're living with HIV, you're a moral citizen if you are on treatment and before treatment use condoms. So to not test or to not know your status or to be living with HIV and not be on treatment is now morally a transgression. There is widespread evidence that HIV stigma has reduced over time. We saw this in the pop art study, but there's still a high level of stigma and it's too common. We also see that having HIV still carries associations with sex, with death, with being sick. And this results in most people living with HIV choosing, on the whole, to keep their HIV status a secret. So for young women living with HIV in Lusaka, they said they told lies every day to avoid others knowing their status. And for a transgender woman in South Africa, said that her HIV positive status was a state secret. So the next point is about where you test and who you test with and who is present when you test. And one way to think about this is place being a sort of physical area and space being values and attitudes and social interactions imposed on it. So in the quote here, adult men reflect on the social risk. An adult man in Lusaka reflects on the social risk of being seen, men to being seen to test at the clinic. And the visual is from a study that we did on health facility space and stigma. And it shows how HIV testing is associated with the reception area and that art delivery spaces are experienced as both comfortable and uncomfortable by people living with HIV. So if we think about space and place, we see that the testing in the HIV in a health facility is a bit more anonymous than accessing care. But if you test positive and you then have to access care, but you become much more identifiable because of the systems and the items in place. Also, who you are when you test positive affects how you experience this. We know that, for example, that there's a lot of judgmental attitudes held by health workers. We also know that for men whose partners come forward for antenatal testing, that they are also requested to come forward for testing, and that sometimes they feel coerced or trapped by this. And that what we saw was that testing HIV positive at the health facility is not always accompanied by counselling support. Likewise, testing within the household can be an invasion of privacy, and it can be more difficult if the person who's testing you knows you, and that HIV self-testing approaches, we saw that women were more likely to receive the tests and men to be the main users, but linking to care if you test positive or finding out what the results were is much more problematic. And then in many of these urban communities, houses are very open and it's very difficult to establish confidentiality. In community hubs, these seem to be very heavily preferred by men, and in the study that we did, that over 36% percent of men not reached by door-to-door were reached through community hubs. So lastly, and we've heard much about this morning, is a wider identity. So most people prefer to be identified more widely and not defined by a health condition that they have. Or sometimes people can't choose to be defined except by a wider identity. So the quote is a young man who's caught between the assumptions that men get HIV by having too many sexual partners and wanting to prove and perform that he was different. So when we're thinking about testing, there's an interaction or interface between the wider identity that people have and wanting or choosing to test. So for example, if we look at men and masculinity, men, there's an analysis that a colleague of mine did within the pop art trial, sort of from a psychology and discourse perspective, showed that men have really very deep anxieties about HIV testing, and that they feel very uncomfortable with the topic, and this manifests in sort of humor and avoidance, and indeed even waiting until they're sick, so when they do test, if they're found positive, that can be interpreted, she argues, as an act of bravery. Likewise, for young women, like men, are less likely to test and less likely to disclose, and they're more likely, in the ethnography in Lusaka, they often kept secret about their status. But keeping secret doesn't mean that you don't end up feeling guilty and anxious about that. Middle class is a subpopulation that we often overlook in Zambia and South Africa. We know that they have a lower rate of public HIV testing, and they also are reached by fewer HIV initiatives, and yet they face their own sort of challenges with accessing testing. For example, healthcare workers living with HIV, who ironically are so often involved in delivering HIV services, themselves really face big barriers testing for HIV. And other sexual identities can make it very challenging to come forward for testing. And indeed, some other sexual identities can sit, or other identities can sit more heavily than HIV stigma itself. So it's safer to maintain these public-private boundaries through having very limited disclosure. So just to finalize, I worry that having been so good at counselling in the late 1980s and early 1990s, having developed so many really robust counselling approaches and courses, that we are too quick to drop counselling from the testing approaches we're using now. We're too keen to normalise HIV, and in the process we overlook mental health well-being of people living with HIV, both at the testing event and beyond to what lies ahead. So the community recognise and say that they would like more professional counselling for people who test HIV positives. We have so many models to draw on. We maybe need to think about tweaking to deal with gender dynamics, to provide more practical tools for disclosure counselling, and we have lots of opportunities that we can turn to. So I'd like to thank the communities that participated in pop arts, the social science teams that I've worked with, individuals that supported me with thinking about this, and research institutes. And last but not least, the HPTN trial for supporting the study, also the Gates Foundation for supporting an analysis, further analysis of the study, and for me to be here today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Especially thank you to all the speakers for such interesting presentations, and thank you everyone for listening. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.